racist police officer assumes that a black man in the park is a criminal and arrests him for no reason. Afterwards, the officer realizes that he has just arrested an FBI agent. Marcus Davis sat on a weathered bench in Riverside Park, the late afternoon sun casting a warm glow over the lush greenery. He turned a page in the book he was reading, momentarily losing himself in the quiet rustle of leaves, and the distant laughter of children playing. The park was one of his favorite places, a small sanctuary in a bustling city where he could clear his mind and escape the demands of his job today, though his thoughts were interrupted across the park. Officer Brian Harkins patrolled the area, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He had walked this beat for over 2 decades, and in his mind he knew this city better than anyone when he noticed Marcus sitting alone on the bench. Something in his gut stirred a feeling he had learned to trust. Over the years, a black man sitting alone, too calm, too composed, suspicion prickled at the edges of his thoughts. Never seen him around here before, Brian muttered under his breath. He stopped walking and watched Marcus for a moment, trying to place the feeling. There had been reports of a suspect fitting a general description that matched Marcus, a vague, flimsy lead, but it was enough for Brian. Marcus felt the weight of someone's gaze and looked up from his book. He noticed Brian standing a distance away, staring at him with a look that was all too familiar. Marcus had been in situations like this before. He could read the officer's expression easily, prejudice masquerading as concern, a suspicion that had no basis other than the color of his skin, but Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he closed his book slowly, marking the page with a finger, and met Brian's gaze. Brian's grip on his baton tightened. He saw the way Marcus looked at him, steady, unafraid. It unnerved him. "Let's see what this guy's up to," Brian muttered as he started walking towards Marcus. His posture stiffened with each step. He didn't like how Marcus was looking at him, didn't like the calmness, the lack of fear. It was unsettling. Marcus watched Brian approach, keeping his expression neutral. He knew what was coming and had seen it many times before. The situation was already loaded, and he knew that how he responded in the next few moments could determine how it played out. He wasn't in the mood for this today, but he also wasn't going to give the officer any reason to escalate the situation. "Afternoon," Brian said as he reached the bench. His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it. Marcus could hear the underlying suspicion. "Afternoon." Marcus replied, his voice calm and even. He kept his hands visible, resting them on the clothes book in his lap. "What brings you out here today?" Brian asked, his eyes scanning Marcus's face, then flicking to the book he was fishing for. Something, anything to justify the feeling gnawing at him. "Just enjoying the park," Marcus said. "It's a nice day." Brian nodded. Slowly, though, he wasn't really listening. He was more interested in what Marcus wasn't saying and what he could dig out from beneath the surface. "You from around here?" Marcus smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." The non-answer didn't sit well with Brian. He shifted his weight, his stance becoming more confrontational. "Mind if I see some ID?" Marcus's smile faded. This was the point where things could go sideways. He knew his rights, knew he wasn't obligated to show ID just for sitting in a public park, but he also knew that refusing could escalate the situation quickly. Still, he wasn't going to let this officer intimidate him. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, his tone measured. He met Brian's gaze without flinching. Brian bristled at the question. There was that calmness, again, that refusal to be intimidated. It made him uneasy, made him feel like he was losing control of the situation. "You will be if you don't cooperate." Brian shot back his hand, moving to rest on his holster. Marcus took a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral. He didn't like where this was heading, but he wasn't going to back down. "I'm just in a park," he said, his voice steady. "Is there a law against that?" Brian's patience was wearing thin. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew how weak the excuse sounded. He stepped closer, looming over Marcus. Marcus didn't move. He held Brian's gaze, refusing to give him the reaction he was looking for. "And what description is that?" Marcus asked quietly. Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't have a good answer, and he knew it, but admitting that would mean losing faith, losing control. He wasn't about to let that happen. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID now." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thickening between them. Marcus knew he could push back and could assert his rights, but he also knew that doing so could make this situation even more dangerous. He decided to comply. For now, without a word, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his wallet. Brian watched every movement closely, his body coiled like a spring when Marcus handed over his ID. Brian snatched it out of his hand and glanced at it. The name didn't mean anything to him, but that didn't matter. He'd already made up his mind. "Stand up," Brian ordered, stepping back to give Marcus room. Marcus sighed inwardly, but did as he was told, rising. Slowly, from the bench, he kept his hands visible, not wanting to give Brian any reason to claim he felt threatened. "Turn around," Brian said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but pushed it down. He turned around, letting Brian cuff him without resistance. He could hear people nearby, could feel their eyes on him, but he stayed calm, knowing that the worst thing he could do now was give to anger. As Brian tightened the cuffs around Marcus's wrists, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that he was making a mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him. "Stop now." He grabbed Marcus's arm and started leading him towards the patrol car parked nearby. Marcus didn't say a word as they walked, his mind already shifting to what would come next. He wasn't worried about himself. He knew who he was, knew that this officer would find out soon enough, but he couldn't help but feel a deep weariness, a tiredness that went beyond this one encounter. It was the exhaustion of knowing that despite all his accomplishments, all his efforts, he was still seen as just another black man in the eyes of too many people like Officer Brian Harkins. As they reached the patrol car, Brian opened the back door and guided Marcus inside, the tension still hanging in the air. Marcus settled into the SE feet, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. He looked out the window as the car pulled away from the park, watching the trees blur past, wondering how this day, like so many others, had gone so wrong. The patrol car's engine hummed as Officer Brian Harkin drove Marcus Davis toward the precinct. Brian's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white as he processed what had just happened. He didn't like the way Marcus had looked at him back there in the park, calm, unafraid, like he knew something. Brian did it, got at him, made him question his instincts. But his pride wouldn't let him admit that Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him. The city streets blurred by, but his mind wasn't on the passing scenery. Instead, he was focused on what would happen next. He knew the system, knew how quickly things could escalate if he wasn't careful, but he also knew his own power, the authority that came with his position, and authority that Officer Harkin had no idea about. As they neared the precinct, Brian glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Marcus met Brian's eyes in the mirror, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he replied calmly. "I was just reading." "Brian," scoffed, "a guy like you just sitting around reading? You expect me to believe that?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A guy like me," he repeated, his tone measured. Brian hesitated for a moment, realizing the slip in his words, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," he said, trying to justify his actions. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, the tension in the car thickening. When he finally spoke, his voice was cool, controlled. "And what does someone like me look like?" Officer Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew what he was implying, knew how it sounded, but he wasn't about to admit that to Marcus or to himself. Instead, he focused on driving, his frustration mounting as Marcus's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. The car pulled into the precinct's parking lot in Bryant Park. Near the entrance, he got out first, then opened the back door and helped Marcus out, the cuffs still digging into Marcus's wrists. As they walked toward the building, Brian's thoughts raced. He needed to figure out what to do next. This wasn't how arrests were supposed to go. The suspect was supposed to be scared, compliant, not composed and challenging him with every word. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers filing reports, phones ringing, the hum of conversation. Brian led Marcus through the main hall, ignoring the curious glances from other officers. He didn't want to explain himself. Just yet, not until he was sure of his next move. They reached the booking area, and Brian signaled for Marcus to stand by the processing desk. The officer behind the desk, a young man named Officer Jenkins, looked up, surprised to see Brian. "Bringing someone in? What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his eyes flicking to Marcus, then back to Brian. Caught him acting suspicious in the park, Brian replied. His tone clipped. He handed over Marcus's ID, still unwilling to admit that he didn't have a solid reason for the arrest. Jenkins glanced at the ID, then back at Marcus. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but he quickly masked it, nodding. As he began typing into the computer, Marcus noticed the brief hesitation, filing it away. In his mind, the recognition was subtle, but it was there. Someone in this precinct knew who he was. "Captain Bennett's in her office," Jenkins said as he handed the ID back to Brian. "You'll need to take him to her." Brian stiffened slightly. Captain Laura. Bennett was known for being tough but fair, stickler for procedure. He hadn't planned on involving her so soon. "Have a choice." "All right," Brian said, his voice tight. He turned to Marcus, his grip firm on Marcus's arm. "Let's go." Marcus walked beside Brian, his expression still unreadable. As they approached Captain Bennett's office, he could sense the tension in Brian, the uncertainty that the officer was trying so hard to hide. It was the first crack in the armor, and Marcus noted it with quiet satisfaction. Brian knocked on the door, then opened it when he heard Captain Bennett's voice from inside. The office was neat, organized, with a large desk in the center and shelves lined with books and files. Captain Bennett, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a non-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her paperwork. As they entered Officer Harkin, she said, her tone neutral, "What's this about?" Brian stepped forward, guiding Marcus into the room. "Caught this guy in the park, Captain. He was acting suspicious. Wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID, Captain." Bennett's gaze shifted to Marcus, and for a split second, there was a flicker of recognition, just like Jenkins. But she quickly masked it, her expression turning professional. "Is that so?" she said, her voice even. Maris met her eyes and saw the recognition there. He knew that Captain Bennett was aware of who he was, but she was playing it, carefully waiting to see how Brian would handle the situation. "That's right," Brian continued, oblivious to the silent exchange between Marcus and Bennett. "I brought him in for questioning." Captain Bennett nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I see, and did you have probable cause to arrest him?" Brian hesitated, feeling the ground beneath him start to shift. He wouldn't cooperate. "Captain," he repeated, though it sounded weaker this time. "Captain." Bennett leaned back in her chair, studying Brian carefully. "Officer Harkin, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis." "Alone?" Brian blinked, taken aback by the request. "But Captain, outside." Harkins, Bennett said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Brian released Marcus and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, Captain Bennett's demeanor shifted, slightly becoming less formal. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice calm, "apologize for this misunderstanding." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Bennett sighed, glancing at the closed door. "I'm aware of who you are, but I'd appreciate if we kept that under wraps for now. I need to handle this situation carefully." Marcus nodded. "Of course, I'm not here to cause trouble, Captain. I just want to make sure things are handled properly." "They will be," Bennett assured him. "I'll speak with Officer Harkin and deal with this appropriately, but I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are?" Marcus's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My identity shouldn't be the reason he decides to treat me with respect, Captain." Bennett considered his words, then nodded in. "Understanding, you're right, it shouldn't matter, but unfortunately, it does to some people." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Finally, "Captain." Bennett stood up. "I'll call officer. Harken back in, will resolve." This Marcus nodded again, watching as Captain Bennett MVE to the door. The confrontation wasn't over, but he knew he had the upper hand. Now the truth would come out soon enough, and Officer Harkin would have to face the consequences of his actions. As Captain Bennett opened the door, Brian stepped back inside his expression wary. He could sense that something had shifted, but he didn't know what. He glanced at Marcus, who stood calmly waiting. "Mr. Davis here is not the man you were looking for. You'll release him immediately." Brian blinked, the words taking a moment to sink. "In what but, Captain, he?" "Immediately, Officer Bennett," repeated her voice, leaving no room for argument. Brian hesitated, then finally reached for the keys to unlock Marcus's handcuffs. His hand shook slightly as he did so, though the realization of his mistake beginning to dawn on him. As the cuffs clicked open, Marcus rubbed his wrists, giving Brian a measured look. "Thank you, officer." He said, his tone calm but carrying an undertone of finality. Brian swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "You're free to go," he muttered, stepping back. Marcus nodded and turned to Captain Bennett. "I'll be in touch, Captain," he said quietly. "There's still a lot to discuss, Captain." Bennett nodded in return, understanding the weight behind his words. "I look forward to it, Mr. Davis." With that, Marcus walked out of the office, leaving Brian standing there, sinking, feeling in his gut the confrontation was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Brian Heron sat at his desk in the precinct, the tension in his body refusing to dissipate. He had barely been able to concentrate since Captain Bennett had released Marcus Davis. The unease noted him deepened by the fact that he still didn't understand what had just happened. He knew he had made a mistake, but the full extent of it was still out of reach. The silence of the precinct around him was both comforting and unnerving, a space for his thoughts to spiral. Suddenly the sound of footsteps approaching his desk snapped him out of his wry. He looked up to see Captain Bennett walking toward him, her expression serious. Brian's stomach tightened. He knew this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Officer Harkins, my office now." Captain Bennett said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Brian stood up immediately, trying to suppress the nervousness that was beginning to creep into his demeanor. He followed her to the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. Once inside, Captain Bennett closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. Brian hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken weight of what was coming. Captain Bennett moved behind her desk, took a deep breath, and then sat down across from him, her sharp eyes fixed on his officer. "Harkin," she began, her tone measured but stern. "Do you have any idea who Marcus Davis is?" Brian shook his head, his confusion deepening. "No, Captain. Just some guy in the park." Captain Bennett leaned forward, her gaze never leaving Brian's. "Marcus Davis isn't just some guy in the park. He's a special agent, one of their top agents." In fact, the words hit Brian like a physical blow. His eyes widened in shock, the implications of what he had done crashing down on him. "An FBI agent," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's right, Bennett," said her voice, firm, "and more than that, he's highly respected within the Bureau. His arrest is going to have serious consequences, not just for you, but for this entire precinct." Brian's mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man, a federal agent no less, based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions. The enormity of his mistake began to settle in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know, Captain." Brian said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was. That's the problem." Harkins Bennett replied, her tone still firm. It shouldn't have mattered. Who he was, your actions were based on assumptions and prejudices, not on any real evidence. You can't arrest someone just because they don't look like they belong. In a park, Brian wanted to argue to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come deep. Down, he knew Captain Bennett was right. He had let his biases guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. What happens now? Brian asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Bennett sighed, leaning back in her chair. For now, you're being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I've already spoken with the higher-ups, and they're not happy, to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action up to and including termination. Brian's heart sank. Termination, the word hung in the air. Like a death sentence, he had been a cop for over 2 decades, and the thought of losing his career was almost too much to bear, but as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. I understand, Captain Brian, finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bennett studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. I know this isn't easy to hear, Harkin, but you need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you serve. We can't afford to have officers who let their biases dictate their decisions. Brian nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and with it came a flood of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected the community, but now all of that was in jeopardy because of one careless, prejudiced decision. Captain Bennett stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. You're dismissed, officer. Harkin, I'll notify you when the review is scheduled. Brian stood up as well, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. Thank you, Captain, he mumbled before turning and walking out of the office. As he left the precinct, the familiar sights and sounds that had once brought him comfort now felt distant, almost alien. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had been a cop for so long that he didn't know who he was without the badge. The thought